Welcome everybody and welcome to another episode of Animal Crossing Teaches the Bill of Rights. So far on the show, we've been looking into how the Bill of Rights protects our First Amendment rights, freedom of speech, press, religion, assembly, petition. We looked at how procedural due process protects us from persecution in the government and some unfair practices from law enforcement. Today, we're going to go back to the beginning of the Bill of Rights, and we're going to be looking into, of course, the Second Amendment. Now, the Second Amendment is arguably the most controversial aspect of our Constitution in modern-day America, because everybody you talk to is going to have a pretty staunch opinion on the subject. If you look at one end of the spectrum, on the left, you'll see liberals usually see gun ownership as an outdated concept that causes unnecessary danger to society, and it basically serves as a medium for random violence, leading to school shootings and other acts of terror. In recent years, in light of the events such as Sandy Hook or the Stoneman Douglas shootings, there's been greater calls on the left for gun control. But on the flip side, conservatives and libertarians hold the Second Amendment in arguably the highest priority. They see gun control as a move towards tyranny, because gun ownership goes hand in hand with their adversarial view of the government, seeing that the right to own a gun is basically a means to protecting the other rights that we hold near and dear. Well, today we're going to look at the Second Amendment, and we're going to be thinking about why the founders included it in the Bill of Rights in the first place, and how it has been interpreted by the courts in a way that's enabled Americans to own 46% of all civilian-owned firearms worldwide. Let's start by looking at the amendment in the first place. A well-regulated militia being necessary for the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. The founders included the Second Amendment following the First Amendment, which contains our most sacred rights. Now, it might be speculation on my part, but I personally see this as a pretty logical progression. The founders likely followed the right to free speech, religion, press, assembly, and petition with the right to bear arms, because gun ownership at the civilian level would be a check on the government's movements towards tyranny. If you think about it, it makes sense. Civilian gun ownership and the preservation of a well-trained militia was exactly what was needed to fend off the British and King George III's oppression of the colonists. The Minutemen who took on the Redcoats couldn't have done so without their muskets, and therefore gun ownership could provide a message sent loud and clear to the newly formed American government that the citizens would not allow for tyranny again, even if it meant taking up armed revolution against their own government. And it's not like the founders invented this idea of having a well-trained citizenry with weapons. John Locke talks about this in his 2 treatises on government, who we stole many ideas from in the Declaration of Independence, such as natural rights theory. John Locke says that if popular sovereignty is not maintained and self-government fails, that form of government needs to be dissolved. Basically, if the new American government were to fail the people, it would be the responsibility of gun-toting citizens to take up arms and defend their fellow Americans. Even the most staunch defenders of this new, more powerful government to be created in the Constitution, like Alexander Hamilton, advocated for civilian ownership of weapons. As he wrote in Federalist 29, if circumstances should at any time oblige the government to form an army of any magnitude, that army can never be formidable to the liberties of the people, while there is a large body of citizens little, if at all, inferior to them in discipline and the use of arms, who stand ready to defend their own rights and those of their fellow citizens. Basically, we must have a well-armed and well-trained citizenry with weapons at the ready to defend their rights if the government were to become a force of tyranny and take away our fundamental natural rights. This thought process still holds true today for many conservatives, who are often more willing to check the power of the federal government in hopes for a greater expansion of civil liberties. Many Republican lawmakers argue that if the Second Amendment were to be tightened in its scope, the very same could happen to our freedom of speech and other important freedoms that were granted to us through the Bill of Rights by the founders of the United States. However, an important thing to bear in mind is we live in a very different society than the founders did. The Second Amendment specifies that gun ownership is necessary for the maintenance of a militia, Many liberals say that the idea of a militia is obsolete as we have a full-scale military, the largest in the world, to defend our national security. Therefore, the musket-bearing founders would disagree, according to liberals, with a civilian owning an automatic rifle, say for the protection of their own home. Liberals, therefore, feel that it is okay for state governments to use gun control as a means to limit gun ownership for the citizenry, which in their eyes will in turn limit violent actions such as school shootings or other acts of terror. The tricky thing is, gun ownership is protected by the Bill of Rights, and so I think it's best that we dive into a scenario to look at how gun ownership has been applied in the United States. Let's dive in. It's time for weekly Fight Club in Camo Frog's basement, and the first match of the week is about to take place. Camo Frog versus the Sensei. Sensei bows to his opponent and the fight is on. Unfortunately for Camo Frog, he took a pretty good lick to the eye and had to tap out. Sensei is full of glee and joy after defeating one of the island's very best martial artists. Sadly, that didn't last for long. The next day he was summoned to Tom Nook's office where he received some bad news. Tom Nook, being the leader of the island, heard that some of the citizens were being roughed up by a certain sensei and he had to put some rules in place. Tom Nook, effective immediately, banned Fight Club, and also in an effort to limit further violence on the island and to maintain order, said that all firearms on the island must remain in each villager's home and must be disassembled at all times, a new form of gun control. Tom Nook saw this as the right thing to do, as it's his job to maintain order on the island, and he felt that the citizens were just getting out of hand with the freedoms they had. This news was devastating to Sensei, as besides his passion for karate, his other favorite hobby was being an avid blow darter. Thwoop! Thwoop! After several days of mourning his disassembled blow dart gun, he had an idea. Sensei remembered that the right to bear arms was protected by the Second Amendment, filed for a petition for a writ of cert under the premise that Tom Nook's gun control law was violating the Constitution. The justices evaluated his petition, and after 4 of them agreed to hear the case, his case would be heard in the Supreme Court. Sensei took a flight to DC and went to the Supreme Court in hope that they would strike down Tom Nook's gun control law using judicial review. However, he was incredibly nervous upon arrival. He realized he wouldn't be just arguing against Tom Nook. He would instead be going up against Stu, who was filing an amicus brief as a representative of the Anti-Karate and Blow Dart League, more popularly known as the AKBL. Stu argued that Tom Nook, as the leader of the island, had the right to initiate this gun control. Because the island was the 51st state of the United States, and gun control was a 10th Amendment granted reserved power, he was in the right to be able to take such extreme measures for the sake of maintaining order in his society. Fortunately, Sensei had an ace up his sleeve, as he had taken AP Gov as an elective at karate school in Okinawa, and remembered that the Supreme Court relied on precedent. He had heard of a case very similar to his own. The case he was referring to was McDonald v. Chicago, a landmark Supreme Court case argued in 2010 where the Second Amendment was upheld. In this case, Otis McDonald didn't have a farm, but a home to protect, and he desired to own a handgun for the protection of his home, which had been burglarized several times. However, the city of Chicago where he lived had created a law that effectively banned handgun ownership. So the question is, did Otis have the right to bear arms? Well, this question goes a bit deeper into our Constitution. The real question of this case was whether or not the Second Amendment applied to the state of Illinois because it was incorporated by the 14th Amendment's Due Process and Privileges and Immunities Clause. This is the case because the Bill of Rights wasn't originally meant to apply to the states, instead just the federal government. That all changed though with the passage of the 14th Amendment, which contained 2 clauses which made it so states couldn't pass laws that violated the privileges and immunities of citizens or laws that deprived persons of life, liberty, or property without due process of the law. This created the concept of selective incorporation and substantive due process. A part of the Bill of Rights may be incorporated to the states, meaning the states may have to follow it if a state law violates the idea of due process, meaning that it got rid of one of the fundamental ideas in the Bill of Rights. This Chicago law did that, of course, as it completely outlawed the idea of legally owning a handgun in the city. Because this law violated the natural rights of Americans according to the Constitution, the Second Amendment was incorporated to the states, and McDonald won the case. Now, all states would have to abide by the Second Amendment, and this of course meant that the Chicago law outlawing handguns was deemed unconstitutional. Clearly, we can see that the courts in this case viewed that the Second Amendment was a viable way to protect our individual liberties from the tyranny of the government, and therefore, state laws that undermine the Second Amendment must be struck down as unconstitutional. So, in review, the Second Amendment was created as a way to protect our other liberties, because a well-trained group of citizens could be a constant check on the government. If they're going to step towards tyranny and take away our other rights, that could mean revolution. Many conservatives still believe that this is the case, that we should maintain the Second Amendment as a way to maintain our natural rights. On the other hand, liberals feel like the Second Amendment no longer really serves a practical purpose in protecting our natural rights and liberties, and instead leads to unnecessary violence. Therefore, gun control should be encouraged. However, gun control laws such as the one we saw in McDonald versus Chicago can't undermine the Second Amendment completely. States must follow and acknowledge the Second Amendment. So while states can implement some gun control regulations, getting rid of gun ownership in general is unconstitutional. So after ruling on precedent, Sensei won his case. And of course, after flying back to the island, he did his favorite activity, the whoop, the end.